The note landed beside Ronan Cassano's water glass with such practiced casualness that anyone watching would have mistaken it for a routine wine list. But the young waitress's trembling fingers told a different story entirely. Her eyes held a warning that transcended words, a plea wrapped in terror that made the powerful man's instincts flare, with recognition of danger he couldn't yet identify. Ronan's hand moved to unfold the paper with deliberate slowness while maintaining the relaxed posture of someone discussing quarterly profits, rather than reading what might be his death sentence. The crystal chandeliers of Soffitto d'Oro cast golden light across tables draped in Italian linen, creating an atmosphere of old-world elegance that attracted Philadelphia's elite every evening without fail. Ronan had chosen this restaurant specifically because its owner owed him favors that guaranteed privacy, discretion, and security that went beyond what any reservation could buy. The vaulted ceiling with its hand-painted frescoes depicted scenes of Roman banquets, where emperors feasted without fear, an irony that wasn't lost on him now. "You're in a trap. Don't move." The handwriting was rushed but legible, pressed hard enough into the paper that he could feel the urgency through his fingertips, even before his mind processed the implications. His meeting with the distribution network representatives was scheduled to begin in 12 minutes, a negotiation that would expand his legitimate business operations into 3 new territories. The timing of this warning suggested someone knew about tonight's meeting, knew its importance, and had positioned themselves to exploit his presence here. Ronan's eyes found the waitress across the dining room where she stood near the kitchen doors, her posture rigid with the kind of fear that came from witnessing something terrible rather than imagining it. She was young, maybe 23, with the exhausted grace of someone working double shifts to pay for dreams deferred by economic reality. Her uniform was impeccable despite the late hour, her dark hair pulled back in a style that emphasized features too delicate for the hardness he saw in her expression now. The restaurant's ambient noise, the gentle murmur of conversation, the soft jazz piano from the corner stage, the discreet clinking of silverware against porcelain, suddenly felt like a carefully orchestrated soundtrack to violence waiting in the wings. Ronan had survived 2 decades in a world where paranoia was survival instinct, by learning to read rooms the way scholars read ancient texts. 3 men sat at the bar nursing drinks they hadn't actually consumed, their attention fixed on reflections in the mirror behind the bottles. 2 more unfamiliar faces occupied a corner booth with sightlines to both his table and the main entrance, their conversation too animated to be genuine given how their eyes kept tracking his position. The restaurant's layout suddenly revealed itself as a tactical nightmare. Too many blind spots, too many approaches, exits that funneled through choke points perfect for ambush. His usual bodyguards were positioned outside per the restaurant's policy about armed security disturbing the dining atmosphere, a rule he'd accepted because this was supposed to be neutral territory. The waitress moved toward his table again with a wine bottle held at an angle that partially obscured her face from the bar's sightline. Her approach calculated to seem routine while actually being anything but. Ronan adjusted his position to appear engaged with the menu, while actually cataloging every potential threat and exit route within his expanding awareness. His phone sat face down on the table, useless for calling help, because any obvious move would trigger whatever was waiting to spring closed around him. The evening had started with such promise, a legitimate business expansion that would finally let him transition fully away from the shadows that had defined his life since his father's organization fell into his hands at age 22. 8 years of carefully building legal enterprises, of distancing himself from the violence that had claimed 3 generations of Cassano men before him, and now someone wanted to drag him back into the darkness. The irony tasted bitter as the espresso he'd been served before the note arrived. Scarlett, her name tag caught the light as she approached, set down the wine bottle and began the performance of describing its vintage, with words that meant nothing compared to what her eyes were communicating. "This Barolo is known for its complexity," she said in a voice steady despite the terror underneath. "It requires patience to fully appreciate all the layers that aren't immediately obvious to casual observation." Her gaze flicked almost imperceptibly toward the kitchen, then to the bar, then back to him with an intensity that conveyed volumes. Ronan's mind raced through possibilities with the speed of someone trained to calculate odds while bullets flew, except no bullets were flying yet, and that was somehow worse than open combat. The men at the bar could be hired contractors, the booth occupants could be backup, but what concerned him most was the timing that suggested inside knowledge. Only 5 people knew about tonight's meeting location, and 3 of them were supposed to arrive in 8 minutes to join him at this table that now felt like a bullseye. The wine remained untouched between them like a prop in a play where both actors had forgotten their scripted lines and were improvising survival instead. Scarlett's hands had stopped trembling, but only because she'd locked her muscles into rigid control, the kind of forced calm that preceded either breakthrough or breakdown. Ronan tilted his head with the practiced gesture of someone asking about wine recommendations while actually inviting her to continue the most dangerous conversation of both their lives. Philadelphia's autumn night pressed against the restaurant's tall windows, the street outside busy with pedestrians who had no idea that inside this elegant establishment, a game of life and death was unfolding over white tablecloths and crystal stemware. The normalcy of the world beyond these walls felt like a mockery of the violence brewing within them. Ronan could see his reflection in the darkened glass, a man who looked calm and collected, while his mind worked through scenarios that all ended in blood. The kitchen doors swung open, and a chef emerged carrying fresh bread to a nearby table, his movements routine and unremarkable except that his eyes never once glanced in Ronan's direction. That absence of curiosity was itself suspicious, because everyone in Philadelphia knew who Ronan Cassano was, knew that his presence in any establishment was noteworthy, even if his legitimate businesses had eclipsed his darker reputation. The deliberate avoidance suggested complicity or fear, both of which pointed to conspiracy that extended beyond the men at the bar. Scarlett's breathing had become shallow, visible in the slight rise and fall of her shoulders, as she stood beside his table pretending to wait for his verdict on the wine. She was trapped in this moment just as surely as he was, her choice to warn him having already marked her as either hero or casualty depending on how the next minutes unfolded. The courage required to slip that note onto his table while knowing the consequences of being caught was the kind of bravery that couldn't be taught or faked. The jazz pianist finished his piece, and the brief silence before the next song felt pregnant with terrible possibility, a held breath before the storm broke. Ronan noticed that the three men at the bar had synchronized their movements, each reaching for their drinks at the same moment in a choreography that spoke of training and preparation. The trap was tightening with each passing second, invisible walls closing in while he sat immobile by necessity rather than choice. His business partners would walk through those doors expecting security and privacy, would trust that his reputation for caution had made this meeting safe, would die because they believed in the myth of Ronan Cassano's invincibility. The weight of that impending failure pressed down on him like physical force, because leadership meant protecting those who followed, meant ensuring that trust was never weaponized against the trusting. His transition to legitimate business had been meant to prevent exactly this kind of bloodshed. The manager appeared from the back office, a thin man with nervous energy who kept touching his tie as if it were choking him, his eyes scanning the dining room with the anxiety of someone expecting disaster. He exchanged a brief glance with one of the men at the bar, a moment of connection so quick that anyone not looking for it would have missed it entirely. Ronan caught it, though, added it to the growing constellation of evidence that this trap had been constructed with inside assistance from multiple angles. Scarlett shifted her weight almost imperceptibly, a movement that drew Ronan's attention to her feet where she'd positioned herself to block the most direct line of sight from the bar to his head. She was using her own body as a shield without making it obvious, sacrificing her safety for his in a gesture that spoke of character, forged by experiences he could only guess at. The casual heroism of it struck him harder than the betrayal, because he'd spent years surrounded by people whose loyalty was purchased rather than freely given. Some guests prefer bold flavors, Scarlett continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as she leaned in to pour a sample that neither of them had any intention of drinking. But tonight, I'd recommend avoiding the chef's special entirely because the kitchen received unusual ingredients this afternoon from a supplier nobody recognizes. The implication hit Ronan like physical impact. Poison, contamination. Something in the food itself meant to eliminate him while he sat defenseless among civilians who would become collateral damage. His signature dish here was the osso buco, a preparation the chef made specifically for him with a recipe that took 6 hours and ingredients sourced from exclusive vendors he'd personally vetted. Someone had infiltrated that supply chain, had positioned themselves to deliver death on a plate, while he relaxed in the false security of familiar surroundings. The sophistication of the plan revealed professional execution, the kind of coordinated effort that required resources and inside information that should have been impossible to obtain. The usual staff called in sick today, Scarlett added while straightening the already perfect table setting, her movements giving her reason to linger without arousing suspicion from the watchers. All 3 of the servers who normally work your section, plus the sommelier you always request, all with the same stomach flu that came on suddenly this morning. The pattern was too clean to be coincidence, too coordinated to be natural illness, which meant the restaurant had been systematically compromised to leave him vulnerable. Ronan's meeting partners would arrive expecting the security and privacy he'd guaranteed, walking into an ambush designed to eliminate everyone at this table simultaneously and permanently. The elegance of it was almost admirable. Take out the leadership of 4 territories in one strike. Leave the organization scrambling for succession, while someone else seized control. Except admiration was a luxury he couldn't afford when his life expectancy was now measured in the minutes remaining before his guests arrived, and the trap snapped shut with lethal finality. The men at the bar had shifted position slightly, adjusting angles that improved their firing lanes while maintaining the appearance of casual patrons enjoying after-work drinks. Ronan recognized the micro-adjustments of professionals checking their zones, ensuring clean shots without civilian interference, waiting for the signal that would transform this temple of cuisine into a slaughterhouse. The restaurant's gold-leafed ceiling would witness violence that contradicted everything its beauty represented, unless he found a way to break the pattern tightening around him. Scarlett's eyes held a question she couldn't voice aloud, a desperate inquiry about whether her warning had been enough, or if more information was needed to save a man she didn't know, but couldn't let die. Ronan's slight nod gave her permission to continue their deadly charade, this performance of wine service that was actually strategic intelligence transfer between unlikely allies. Her knowledge of the restaurant's operation was proving more valuable than any bodyguard's firepower, because she'd noticed details his security sweep had missed entirely. The manager received a phone call an hour ago that changed tonight's seating arrangements, she murmured, while adjusting the angle of his wine glass with unnecessary precision. Your table was moved from its usual position by the window to here in the center where there's no quick access to exits and maximum exposure from multiple directions. The tactical disadvantage was now obvious. He sat in a kill box designed by someone who understood both the physical space and his own habits well enough to exploit them. The positioning meant his usual security protocols had been anticipated and countered before he'd even arrived, suggested planning that extended weeks or months rather than days, indicated an enemy who'd studied him with the patience of a predator selecting the perfect moment to strike. Ronan's career had been built on staying 3 moves ahead of opposition, on reading patterns before they fully formed, but this trap had been constructed in his blind spots by someone who knew exactly where those vulnerabilities existed. Scarlett's shift had started at 4 in the afternoon, early enough to witness the unusual preparations that the evening staff would have missed entirely and accepted as normal routine. She'd seen the kitchen receiving deliveries that bypassed the usual inspection procedures, watched the manager making calls in Italian to people who weren't the regular suppliers, noticed how certain staff members avoided making eye contact with each other as if shared guilt prevented natural interaction. Her outsider perspective had caught what insiders were trained to overlook, or complicit enough to ignore. There's a server named Marcus, Scarlett continued, naming someone with deliberate care as if she understood the weight that name would carry. He keeps checking his watch and looking at your table even though this isn't his section, and twice I've seen him step outside to make phone calls that left him looking satisfied in a way that made my skin crawl. Marcus. The name landed in Ronan's consciousness like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of betrayal spreading outward from the point of impact. Marcus had been with his organization for 6 years, had risen through ranks based on demonstrated loyalty and competence, had access to schedules and security details that would make planning this ambush infinitely easier. The betrayal carried personal sting, because Ronan had trusted him with responsibilities that extended beyond professional duty into something resembling friendship. They'd shared meals, discussed philosophy, debated the ethics of power, conversations that now felt like reconnaissance disguised as camaraderie. The restaurant's atmosphere remained unchanged to casual observation. Couples celebrating anniversaries, business associates closing deals over dessert wine, a birthday party in the private alcove filling the space with laughter that sounded obscene given what was unfolding. These innocent people would scatter in terror or freeze in shock when violence erupted, would become obstacles or casualties depending on where they stood when professional killers began eliminating targets. Their presence complicated any response that involved fighting back. Ronan's phone vibrated with an incoming text from his business partners confirming they were 5 minutes away, a countdown to catastrophe that required immediate decision-making without the luxury of careful analysis. The golden light that had seemed so elegant now felt like stage lighting illuminating his final performance, casting shadows that could hide weapons or witnesses, depending on how the next minutes unfolded. His mind calculated angles and odds with the cold precision that had kept him alive through 2 decades of navigating lethal complications. Scarlett stepped back from the table with the wine bottle cradled against her chest like armor, Her role in this deadly theater apparently concluded unless he found a way to communicate his next move. Her courage in delivering the warning had already exceeded what anyone could reasonably expect from a stranger with no stake in his survival beyond basic human decency. Yet something in her expression suggested she wasn't finished, that having committed to saving him, she intended to see it through, despite the danger that commitment invited. The jazz pianist transitioned into a slower melody that seemed to mock the urgency pounding through Ronan's veins, a romantic standard about love conquering all playing, while actual conquest of the lethal variety waited for its cue. He watched Marcus emerge from the kitchen carrying a covered silver platter, the theatrical presentation that would deliver poison directly to his table. The timing was perfect. Serve the lethal meal, wait for that first bite, then coordinate the attack while his system began shutting down, and his ability to respond deteriorated with each passing second. The trap's elegance revealed itself in layers, each component designed to eliminate his advantages while maximizing enemy effectiveness through coordination that spoke of military precision, rather than criminal improvisation. Ronan had built his reputation on being unkillable, on surviving situations that had claimed bolder men, but hubris was the downfall of every empire, and his assumption of invincibility had made him predictable. The realization burned because the trap had been constructed from his own patterns, his preferences weaponized against him. Scarlett's hand moved to the small of her back where servers kept their order pads and pens, a gesture that appeared routine, until Ronan noticed she was palming something else entirely, a phone positioned to record whatever happened next, her insurance policy or her evidence, depending on whether they survived the next 10 minutes to need either. The preparation revealed a mind that thought in contingencies, that understood documentation might be the only justice available if violence won. The restaurant's front door opened, and Ronan's first business partner entered, a man named Vincent, who controlled distribution networks across 3 states and trusted that tonight's meeting represented opportunity rather than execution. Vincent's smile was visible even from across the dining room, the expression of someone arriving at what he believed was the beginning of profitable expansion. That innocence was about to be shattered, unless Ronan found a way to communicate danger without triggering the trap prematurely or causing panic that would endanger everyone present. Ronan caught Scarlett's eye and made a subtle gesture toward his untouched water glass, a signal she interpreted with the quick intelligence of someone who'd learned to read difficult customers and dangerous situations with equal facility. She moved toward him again with a fresh bottle of sparkling water, creating another opportunity for communication under the guise of attentive service. The men at the bar tracked her movement but dismissed it as routine, their attention focused on the front entrance where Vincent was being greeted by the hostess. "The kitchen exit leads to an alley that connects to Market Street," Scarlett whispered while refilling his glass, her words so quiet they were almost subvocal. "But there's a delivery scheduled for 9:30 that will block that route with trucks, and I overheard Marcus telling someone on the phone that all exits would be covered by then." She was giving him tactical information that could mean the difference between escape and entrapment, details gathered through the careful observation of someone whose survival instincts were highly developed. The time was 9:15, which meant he had a 15-minute window before even the emergency exits became compromised, before the trap achieved total containment and his options collapsed to zero. Vincent was making his way across the dining room now, his path taking him past the bar where the 3 men watched with predatory focus. Ronan needed to warn him, to abort this meeting and scatter everyone to safety, but any obvious alarm would trigger immediate violence from people clearly prepared to act. Marcus approached the table with the covered platter held high, his performance of the dutiful server so perfectly executed that anyone who didn't know better would never suspect the betrayal underneath. His eyes met Ronan's for a fraction of a second, and something flickered there: regret, satisfaction, fear, emotions too complex to parse in the instant before professional mask reasserted itself. The silver dome would lift to reveal death disguised as cuisine, and the moment Ronan reacted with suspicion, the men at the bar would interpret it as their cue. Scarlett positioned herself between Marcus and the table, with the timing of someone stepping into traffic to push a child to safety, her body language suggesting she'd remembered something urgent about the wine selection. "Actually, sir, I apologize, but I need to verify something about your order with the kitchen before this is served," she said with enough volume to be heard by nearby tables. Marcus's expression tightened with annoyance that didn't quite mask his alarm at this deviation from script, his eyes darting toward the bar seeking guidance on whether to push forward or maintain cover. The moment stretched like taffy, everyone frozen in tableau while unspoken questions ricocheted between the conspirators trying to decide if their operation had been compromised. Scarlett maintained her apologetic smile while her hand remained on the platter's edge, preventing Marcus from setting it down through sheer physical obstruction disguised as solicitous service. Her audacity was either brilliant or suicidal, possibly both, and Ronan felt something shift in his chest that wasn't just gratitude, but recognition of a spirit that matched his own capacity for calculated risk. Vincent reached the table looking puzzled by the strange standoff between servers that seemed to violate every protocol of fine dining service. "Ronan, is everything all right?" he asked, with the concern of someone sensing tension without understanding its source. His question gave Ronan the opening he needed to stand, while appearing to address a simple service issue rather than preparing for combat. "Actually, Vincent, I think we should move to a different table," Ronan said in a tone that suggested preference rather than urgency, his eyes communicating volumes that his casual words didn't convey. The men at the bar shifted in unison, hands moving toward concealed weapons with the synchronization that confirmed Scarlett's warning about coordinated attack. But Ronan's movement had been smooth enough not to trigger immediate violence, calculated to seem like the whim of a demanding customer rather than recognition of danger. Vincent, no fool despite missing the immediate threat, picked up on Ronan's tension and nodded without argument. Marcus stood holding the platter with growing desperation as his perfect plan unraveled through the intervention of a waitress who should have been invisible. "The window table just became available," Scarlett announced with bright professionalism that completely contradicted the terror in her eyes. "It has a much better view, and I know Mr. Cassano prefers natural light when discussing business matters." The lie was transparent to anyone who knew that night had fallen hours ago, but it provided social cover for the movement away from the kill zone. She turned toward the windows, leading the way with the wine bottle still clutched like a talisman against evil. Ronan and Vincent followed her across the dining room, their path taking them away from the center position and toward the periphery where exits became accessible and exposure decreased. The birthday party's laughter provided audio cover for the scraping of chairs and murmured apologies to other diners as they navigated between tables. Every step felt like walking through deep water, resistance building with each foot traveled while the predators at the bar recalculated their approach. The manager materialized from his office with the expression of someone who'd been monitoring events and didn't like how they were developing. "Is there a problem with your table, Mr. Cassano?" he asked with forced courtesy that barely masked accusation. His question was directed at Ronan, but his eyes were on Scarlett, recognition that she'd somehow interfered with plans that extended beyond restaurant operations into conspiracy. The danger she'd placed herself in by helping him crystallized in that look. Naked threat barely concealed by professional veneer. "No problem at all," Ronan replied smoothly, while positioning himself between the manager and Scarlett with territorial instinct he didn't pause to examine. "Just a preference for different ambiance, and this young lady has been extraordinarily attentive to ensuring our comfort." The emphasis on extraordinarily served as both praise and warning, acknowledgement that he knew what she'd done and wouldn't allow retaliation. His reputation still carried weight even in spaces that had been compromised against him. The new table by the windows was actually worse from a tactical perspective, more exposed to street visibility, farther from the kitchen exit Scarlett had mentioned, positioned where they'd be silhouetted against the glass for anyone outside. But it had one crucial advantage: proximity to the main entrance, and the bodyguard's position just beyond it, who could be summoned with a gesture. The move had bought time and options, transformed the trap from inescapable to merely dangerous, created space for countermeasures that hadn't existed in the center kill zone. Marcus remained frozen near the abandoned table, still holding the platter that was supposed to deliver death, but now just represented failed opportunity. The men at the bar were conferring in urgent whispers, their cover as casual patrons completely abandoned as they calculated whether to abort or adapt their operation. The booth occupants had their phones out, presumably communicating with handlers or backup about the unexpected development. The conspiracy was exposing itself through reaction to disruption, making visible what had been hidden. Vincent settled into the new table with growing awareness that something serious was unfolding beneath the surface of restaurant protocol. "Ronan, talk to me," he said quietly, once Scarlett had moved away toward the wine station. "What am I walking into here?" His directness was one of the qualities that made him valuable in business and dangerous in conflict. He didn't waste time on denial when reality demanded acknowledgement. Ronan leaned forward, voice low enough that only Vincent could hear above the ambient noise. "We're walking out of here in the next 2 minutes," Ronan said without preamble or explanation, his tone carrying command that Vincent recognized and respected. "Call the others. Tell them the meeting is relocated to the backup location. Don't explain why. Just make it happen now." Vincent's hand was already moving toward his phone before Ronan finished speaking. Trust built over years of successful partnership, overriding the need for detailed justification. The text was sent within seconds. Scarlett appeared with fresh wine glasses and water, her hands steadier now that movement had disrupted the trap's perfect positioning. "The delivery trucks arrived early," she murmured while setting down the glasses. "The alley exit is already blocked, and I just saw 2 more men enter through the kitchen entrance wearing the wrong uniforms for our actual suppliers." Her continuous intelligence gathering was keeping them ahead of the conspiracy's adjustments, her eyes and ears throughout the restaurant providing information his own security network had failed to deliver. The front door opened again, and Ronan's remaining 2 business partners entered together, both checking their phones with the confusion of people who'd just received unexpected change of plans notifications. Their presence in the restaurant suddenly represented additional targets. More lives in danger because of the conspiracy aimed at him. The weight of leadership meant accepting that his enemies would strike at those who stood beside him, but acceptance didn't ease the fury building in his chest at the calculated willingness to murder colleagues for territory and power. Ronan made the decision with the clarity that came from accepting that perfect solutions didn't exist when enemies held too many advantages. "Vincent, when I stand, you stand with me and we walk out the front door like men who just remembered another appointment," he said, while maintaining the appearance of casual dinner conversation. "Don't look at the bar, don't acknowledge anything unusual, just follow my lead and trust that the reasons will become clear once we're outside." Vincent nodded once, his expression settling into the focused calm of someone who'd survived dangerous situations by following good instincts. Scarlett was pouring water at a nearby table, but her attention remained locked on their position, tracking the men at the bar who were now openly staring at Ronan's table with the predatory focus of hunters, watching prey prepare to bolt. Her face had gone pale with the realization that events were accelerating toward violence, that her intervention had bought time but not safety, that the trap was adapting to contain them despite her efforts. The birthday party continued their celebration in oblivious joy, singing off-key to someone turning 40 while potential massacre gathered momentum around them. The 2 newly arrived partners reached Ronan's table with questions already forming, but he cut them off with a gesture that communicated urgency without explanation. "Gentlemen, we're leaving immediately," he said, while rising smoothly from his chair, his body language projecting authority rather than fear. "This establishment is experiencing operational difficulties that make it unsuitable for our discussion, and I've already arranged alternative accommodations." The formal phrasing provided social cover for abrupt departure, gave them script to follow that didn't require understanding the true danger. Marcus had abandoned the poisoned platter on a service station and was moving toward the kitchen, presumably to alert whoever was coordinating from that direction that targets were attempting to leave the containment zone. His urgency was visible in the speed of his walk, professional composure cracking under pressure of a plan collapsing in real time. Ronan tracked the movement while guiding his partners toward the exit, calculating how many seconds remained before the conspiracy decided that partial success was better than complete failure. The manager positioned himself near the front door, with the transparent intention of delaying their departure, his thin frame inadequate to physically block 4 grown men, but capable of creating social friction that would cost precious seconds. "Mr. Cassano, surely we can resolve whatever issue has arisen," he began with false solicitude that didn't match the calculation in his eyes. "Perhaps a complimentary bottle of our finest vintage, or a private word in my office to discuss your concerns about tonight's service." Each word was a stalling tactic, buying time for the men at the bar to position themselves. Ronan didn't slow his approach or acknowledge the attempted obstruction, simply continued forward with the inevitability of a freight train, his 3 partners forming a wedge behind him that left the manager the choice between stepping aside or being walked through. The manager's nerve broke first, and he moved to the side with a gesture toward the door that tried to maintain dignity while accepting defeat. "Of course, Mr. Cassano, we hope to see you again soon under better circumstances," he said with venom barely concealed beneath professional courtesy. The front door was 15 feet away, when Scarlett's voice cut through the restaurant's ambient noise with a scream that shattered the elegant atmosphere like a brick through crystal. "Fire! There's smoke coming from the kitchen." Her fabricated alarm triggered exactly the chaos Ronan needed, sending diners lurching to their feet and staff rushing toward the kitchen in the trained response to every restaurant's nightmare scenario. The birthday party scattered, the couples abandoned their romantic dinners, and the carefully maintained order dissolved into confusion. The men at the bar hesitated for the crucial second between recognizing the fire alarm as false and deciding whether to pursue their targets through a panicking crowd or abort the compromised operation. That hesitation cost them the initiative as Ronan and his partners reached the exit and pushed through into Philadelphia's autumn night. The street outside was busy with evening pedestrians, witnesses whose presence transformed assassination from simple to complicated, from clean to messy. Ronan's bodyguards snapped to alertness the moment they saw him emerge ahead of schedule with expression that communicated threat assessment in progress. "We're leaving now. Full protocol," Ronan commanded without breaking stride toward the waiting vehicles positioned strategically along the curb. His security team moved into formation with practiced efficiency, creating a mobile barrier between Ronan's group and the restaurant entrance where figures were emerging with the urgency of predators who'd lost their prey. Vincent and the other two partners were hurried into the first vehicle, while Ronan paused at the door of the second, his attention pulled back toward the restaurant, where Scarlett stood framed in the entrance with smoke from the triggered fire alarm system, creating dramatic backdrop. Her uniform was disheveled from whatever she'd done to create convincing emergency, her face flushed with exertion and fear, her eyes meeting his across the distance with the recognition of two people who'd survived something terrible together. The moment crystallized with the weight of debt that couldn't be immediately repaid, of connection forged in crisis that transcended the normal boundaries between strangers who happened to occupy the same space. Ronan saw Marcus emerge from the kitchen entrance and grab Scarlett's arm with violence that made the decision simple and immediate. He moved toward her with the speed of someone who'd spent decades training his body to respond faster than thought, crossing the sidewalk against the protests of his security team. Marcus had Scarlett's wrist in a grip that was leaving white marks against her skin, his face contorted with rage at how completely her interference had destroyed his carefully constructed betrayal. "You stupid girl, do you have any idea what you've done?" he hissed, with the kind of anger that preceded serious violence. "They'll kill you for this, kill your family, burn down everything you care about until you wish you'd just kept your mouth shut and served the wine." Ronan's hand closed on Marcus's shoulder with enough force to make the man gasp and release Scarlett immediately, survival instinct overriding rage when confronted with someone genuinely dangerous. "She's coming with me," Ronan said in a voice that didn't allow for negotiation or debate. "And if anyone touches her, looks at her wrong, or even thinks about retaliation, they'll discover that my transition to legitimate business didn't make me incapable of protecting people who demonstrate the kind of courage worth protecting." Marcus stumbled backward with the expression of someone recalculating everything they thought they knew, his betrayal suddenly complicated by the recognition that Ronan's gratitude toward Scarlett would make her untouchable through association. The manager appeared in the doorway with two of the men from the bar, their faces revealing the frustration of professionals who'd watched a perfect operation disintegrate through factors they couldn't have predicted or controlled. Fire trucks were approaching with sirens wailing, summoned by automatic alarms that Scarlett's improvised emergency had triggered. Scarlett stood frozen in shock at the speed with which her life had just transformed from ordinary waitress to person, under the protection of Philadelphia's most powerful figure. "I can't just leave," she said with the practical concern of someone who still thought in terms of shifts and tips rather than survival. "My apartment, my things. I have classes tomorrow at community college and rent due on Friday." The mundane concerns of normal life seemed absurd against the backdrop of conspiracy and violence. Yet they were real constraints that couldn't be dismissed. "Your old life ended the moment you slipped me that note," Ronan said, with the blunt honesty of someone who understood how completely one choice could redirect entire trajectories. "Those men will retaliate against anyone connected to tonight's failure, which means you can't go home, can't go to class, can't resume any pattern they could exploit to find you." He watched understanding dawn in her eyes, watched her process the magnitude of consequence flowing from her decision to intervene, watched courage reassert itself even as fear tried to take hold. The fire trucks arrived and firefighters began evacuating the restaurant with professional efficiency, transforming the elegant establishment into a scene of emergency response that would make continuing any conspiracy impossible. Police vehicles followed, drawn by the crowd and the alarm, their presence adding layers of official scrutiny that would force everyone involved to retreat and regroup. The trap had been completely dismantled by a waitress with a pen and enough moral courage to risk everything for a stranger's life. Scarlett looked back at the restaurant one final time, saying goodbye to the person she'd been before tonight, before courage demanded she become someone different and braver and permanently altered by choice. "Okay," she said quietly, her voice steady despite everything. "I'll come with you, but not because I'm afraid, and not because I need protecting, but because I want to see this through and understand why someone would orchestrate mass murder over restaurant Osso Buco." The vehicle pulled away from the curb with the smooth acceleration of someone driving away from trouble rather than fleeing a crime scene, the distinction mattering to witnesses who might later describe what they'd seen. Ronan's security team had positioned 2 chase vehicles in formation, creating a mobile perimeter that discouraged pursuit while appearing to casual observers as merely careful protection. Scarlett sat across from Ronan in the back seat, her server's uniform incongruous against the leather interior, her hands finally starting to shake now that adrenaline was fading and shock was settling in. "Tell me everything you saw today, every detail you remember, no matter how insignificant it seemed at the time," Ronan said, while pulling out his phone to record her account, before memory began its inevitable distortion. "People arrived when, deliveries happened, how, conversations you overheard in what language, anything that struck you as wrong, even if you couldn't articulate why." His questions were precise and methodical, the approach of someone trained to extract actionable intelligence from fragments of observation. Scarlett's account painted a picture of conspiracy that had been building for days rather than hours, preparation that extended beyond tonight's attempted massacre to suggest longer-term planning and significant resources. "Marcus has been acting strange for the past 3 weeks," she recalled while watching Philadelphia streets slide past the tinted windows. "He started taking calls outside during service, which servers never do because you lose tips when you're not on the floor, and he'd come back looking either really satisfied or really stressed depending on the conversation." The timeline matched Ronan's own observations of changes in Marcus's behavior, subtle shifts in routine, questions about schedules that seemed innocent at the time, but now revealed reconnaissance beneath the surface. 3 weeks ago was when I finalized the meeting location and sent the invitations to my partners," Ronan said, pieces connecting with the clarity of hindsight. "Which means Marcus learned about tonight within hours of me scheduling it, fed that information to whoever was coordinating this operation, and they had 21 days to construct the perfect trap." Scarlett continued describing the day's unusual events. Kitchen staff she didn't recognize wearing uniforms that were almost but not quite right. Deliveries arriving at odd times through entrances normally used only for major shipments. The manager's nervous energy that had been attributed to VIP reservations, but now suggested knowledge of impending violence. Each detail added texture to the conspiracy's scope and revealed just how thoroughly the restaurant had been compromised. The usual security measures that should have protected Ronan had been systematically neutralized by inside knowledge. "The chef who prepared your osso buco wasn't our regular chef," Scarlett added, that memory surfacing with sudden clarity. "He came in around 6 o'clock saying he was a specialist in northern Italian cuisine brought in specifically for your dish, and everyone just accepted that because who questions management about VIP preparations?" The substitution explained how poison had entered the preparation, despite Ronan's usual precautions about ingredient sourcing and trusted kitchen staff. The conspiracy had inserted their own person into the one position that could deliver death with certainty. Ronan's phone buzzed with incoming messages from his security director, demanding explanation for the emergency evacuation and change of plans. "Check the backgrounds of everyone who worked at Soffitto d'Oro tonight," he typed in response. "Focus on recent hires, temporary staff, anyone whose employment coincides with the past 3 weeks, and cross-reference their connections to Marcus." The investigation would take hours, but would reveal the full network of people who'd participated in or enabled tonight's attempted massacre. The vehicle convoy navigated through Philadelphia's evening traffic with the efficiency of drivers who knew every alternate route and shortcut, their path designed to make following difficult and ambush impossible. Scarlett watched the city pass with the expression of someone seeing familiar streets through new eyes, ordinary places transformed into potential threats by the knowledge that people wanted her dead for intervening. "Where are we going?" she asked finally, the question carrying implications beyond immediate destination, to encompass the larger uncertainty of what her life had become. "Somewhere safe while we figure out who orchestrated tonight, and why they thought killing me and my partners was worth the attention that mass murder brings from law enforcement," Ronan answered, while considering options that balanced security with the need to continue business operations. "My primary residence is compromised by definition since Marcus knew that address," which means we're heading to a property that exists outside the normal channels of information. The backup location was a contingency he'd established years ago for exactly this scenario, though he'd hoped never to need it. Scarlett's practical mind was already working through implications and consequences that extended beyond her immediate situation. "My roommate will freak out when I don't come home," she said with concern for collateral damage to ordinary relationships. "And my boss at the restaurant will probably fire me for walking out during a shift, though honestly that's the least of my problems right now, given that I might have just made enemies of whoever was willing to commit multiple murders over business territory. Your roommate will receive a call from my assistant within the hour, explaining that you've taken emergency family leave and providing contact information that routes through secure channels," Ronan said, already typing messages to make that happen. "As for your job, I think we can safely assume that Sofitodoro's operations are going to be suspended pending investigation into tonight's fire alarm and the various code violations that inspection will mysteriously discover." The restaurant had become crime scene and evidence, its elegant atmosphere permanently tainted by attempted murder. The convoy turned into an underground garage beneath a modern apartment complex in a neighborhood that Scarlett recognized as substantially more expensive than her current student housing. Security cameras tracked their entrance while reinforced gates closed behind them, technology and physical barriers creating layers of protection between the street and the private elevator that opened directly into a penthouse suite. The space revealed itself gradually as they rose, a residence designed for someone who valued security over ostentation. The penthouse was furnished with comfortable but impersonal furniture that suggested a space maintained for function rather than lived in with personality. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Philadelphia's skyline, the city lights creating constellation of artificial stars that mapped wealth and poverty through illumination intensity. Scarlett stood in the middle of the main room looking lost and overwhelmed, the adrenaline that had sustained her through crisis finally depleting and leaving exhaustion in its place. "There are 3 bedrooms down that hallway. Take whichever one feels right and try to rest," Ronan said while recognizing the signs of shock setting in now that immediate danger had passed. "Tomorrow we'll need to make decisions about next steps and longer-term security. But tonight you've earned the right to collapse and process everything without having to maintain composure." He gestured toward the kitchen where his security team was already preparing food, the smell of coffee beginning to fill the space. Scarlett didn't move toward the bedrooms, but instead walked to the windows, pressing her forehead against the cool glass while staring out at the city she'd lived in for 23 years without ever seeing from this height or perspective. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I hadn't said anything," she murmured, more to herself than to him. All those people in the restaurant, the birthday party with the bad singing, the couple celebrating their anniversary, would they have been killed too or just traumatized witnesses to something horrible? The question revealed the moral weight she was carrying, the responsibility she felt not just for the lives she'd saved, but for the alternative timeline where her silence would have enabled massacre. Ronan recognized that particular burden because he'd carried similar weight for years, the awareness that choices made or avoided rippled outward through lives beyond his own. "You did the right thing," he said simply, offering the absolution she needed to hear, even if she wouldn't fully believe it yet. "The right thing just ended my normal life and made me dependent on a man I don't know for protection against people I can't identify," Scarlett replied, with the edge of someone struggling against circumstances beyond their control. "I'm grateful to be alive, and I don't regret helping you. But let's not pretend this is a fairy tale where the waitress warns the prince and lives happily ever after, because real life doesn't work that way." Her cynicism was earned through whatever experiences had taught her that heroism came with costs. Ronan found himself respecting that hardness, even as he wanted to soften it, drawn to the steel in her that matched his own capacity for facing ugly truths without flinching. "You're right. This isn't a fairy tale," he agreed, while settling into a chair that faced both her and the door in habitual tactical positioning. "But it's also not a tragedy where courage gets punished and evil wins through intimidation, because I've spent my entire adult life ensuring that people who protect others get protected in return." The coffee Vincent brought him was too hot and too strong, exactly the way Ronan preferred it when facing long nights that required sustained alertness and clear thinking. His partners had been secured in separate safe locations pending a full debrief, their lives preserved by Scarlett's intervention, but their business relationship with him now complicated by the attempt on their collective lives. Someone had wanted to eliminate Philadelphia's entire territory leadership in one strike, an ambition that suggested either outsiders making power play or insiders staging coup. Ronan's phone displayed incoming intelligence from his security director as investigators began pulling apart the evening's events with forensic precision. The chef who prepared your dish was hired 2 days ago using forged credentials that wouldn't withstand serious background check, but passed casual verification, the message read. His real name is Dmitry Volkov, known contractor with specialty in untraceable poisons, 15 confirmed kills across 6 countries, and he disappeared from the kitchen before fire trucks arrived. The revelation confirmed that tonight's attempt had been professional operation rather than opportunistic violence, involved international resources rather than local criminals, represented the kind of threat that normally targeted heads of state rather than businessmen transitioning toward legitimacy. Whoever wanted him dead had invested serious money and planning into ensuring success, which raised uncomfortable questions about who possessed both the resources and motivation for that level of commitment. Scarlett emerged from the bedroom wearing borrowed clothes that hung loose on her smaller frame, sweatpants and a t-shirt from the emergency supplies kept in each room. Her hair was wet from a shower that had washed away the restaurant's kitchen smoke and her own terror sweat, leaving her looking younger and more vulnerable than she had while performing heroic interventions. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, while accepting the coffee that Vincent offered with the quiet competence of someone trained to anticipate needs. "The toxicology report came back on the ossobuco," Ronan said, deciding that she deserved to know the full truth of what she'd prevented. Aconite poison derived from wolfsbane, dosage calculated to cause cardiac arrest within 15 minutes of consumption, essentially untraceable in autopsy unless specifically tested for, and administered in a way that would have affected everyone who shared the dish. The clinical description couldn't capture the horror of what would have happened. Powerful men dying in public while their security scrambled to understand threats they couldn't fight. Scarlett's face went white as she processed the reality that she'd prevented not just assassination, but spectacle. The kind of public killing that would have dominated news cycles and triggered investigations reaching the highest levels of government. "They were going to murder you in front of dozens of witnesses," she said slowly, working through implications. "Which means they either didn't care about attention or actively wanted the publicity of killing you that dramatically and publicly." The observation demonstrated strategic thinking that impressed Ronan, despite the grim circumstances. "Exactly right. This wasn't designed to be quiet elimination, but rather public demonstration of power," he confirmed while pulling up additional intelligence reports. "Killing me at home would have been simpler and safer, but killing me along with 3 other territory leaders during a business dinner sends a message that nowhere is safe and no one is untouchable." The psychology behind the method revealed as much as the mechanics of the attempt itself. Marcus's phone records showed calls to a number registered to a shell company with ties to an organization that Ronan had displaced 3 years ago during his consolidation of territories. The previous leadership had been forced into retirement through a combination of legal pressure and strategic maneuvering that left them financially comfortable but politically neutered. Apparently, comfortable retirement wasn't satisfying enough, and they'd spent the intervening years planning comeback built on the foundation of Ronan's corpse. "The conspiracy goes deeper than Marcus," Ronan explained, while sharing the intelligence with Scarlett, trusting her with information he wouldn't normally reveal to outsiders. He was recruited by the Moretti family, old guard operators who controlled Philadelphia before I consolidated their territories under legitimate business structures that they considered insulting to tradition. The Morettis represented everything Ronan had been trying to evolve beyond: violence as first resort, intimidation as business model, legacy defined by body count rather than sustainable enterprise. Scarlett studied the documents with the intensity of someone who understood that knowledge was now her only real protection against threats she'd made enemies of through intervention. "So they spent 3 years planning this, placed Marcus inside your organization, waited until he had access to sensitive information, and then constructed an elaborate trap that would have worked perfectly if a random waitress hadn't happened to overhear the wrong conversation." The summary was accurate, except for her characterization of herself as random, as if courage was accidental rather than chosen. "You weren't random," Ronan corrected, with the certainty of someone who'd spent decades evaluating people's characters under pressure. "You were exactly the right person, in exactly the right place with exactly the right moral compass to recognize evil and refuse to let it proceed unchallenged, which is rarer than you think." He watched her process that assessment, saw her struggling between dismissing it as flattery and accepting it as truth, observed the moment when truth won despite her cynicism. The security director's next message contained information that changed the tactical situation significantly. Marcus just turned himself in to FBI field office, claiming he has information about organized crime and requesting protective custody in exchange for testimony. The move was both smart and desperate, an attempt to trade knowledge for protection from Ronan's anticipated retaliation and from the Moretti's disappointment at his failure to deliver promised massacre. He's scared enough of both sides to think federal prison is safer than freedom, Ronan observed, while considering how Marcus's cooperation would impact the situation, which means he'll provide evidence that dismantles the Moretti conspiracy, but also exposes details of my operations that I'd prefer remained confidential. The betrayal had layers. First the attempt to kill him, now the threat to his carefully constructed legitimate facade through testimony that would reveal how recent that transition actually was. Scarlett moved to the window again, drawn to the view, as if height and distance provided clarity about the complexity unfolding below. "What happens now?" she asked without turning around, her reflection in the glass showing exhaustion and uncertainty in equal measure. The FBI investigates, people get arrested, trials happen, and eventually everyone involved in tonight goes to prison while I try to rebuild a life that will never be truly normal again, because I'll always be looking over my shoulder. The accuracy of her prediction was depressing in its realism. She understood that heroism came with permanent costs, that interventions couldn't be undone, that safety was now something she'd have to actively maintain rather than passively assume. "That's one possible future," Ronan acknowledged, while joining her at the window, standing close enough to see her expression in the reflection. "But there are alternatives that involve you becoming something more than victim or witness to tonight's events." His security team had discovered additional information about the restaurant's ownership structure that revealed another layer to the conspiracy. The Morettis had purchased controlling interest in Soffitto d'Oro 6 months ago through front companies, turning Ronan's preferred meeting location into trap through patient acquisition rather than sudden infiltration. The sophistication suggested planning that extended beyond simple revenge into carefully orchestrated long-term strategy. They'd been studying him, learning his patterns, and constructing the perfect cage. "They bought the restaurant specifically to create this opportunity," Scarlett said, as she reviewed the ownership documents, her quick mind making connections that would have taken others much longer to recognize. "Which means every time you ate there over the past 6 months, they were gathering intelligence about your preferences, your security protocols, your relationships with staff, everything they'd need to make tonight's attempt successful. The violation was intimate, his habits weaponized, his trust exploited, his attempts at normalcy transformed into vulnerabilities." Ronan's phone lit up with incoming call from his attorney, undoubtedly responding to news that Ronan's former lieutenant was in federal custody offering testimony in exchange for protection. "Don't answer it yet," Scarlett said suddenly, her hand on his wrist stopping the motion toward his phone. "Before you start managing the legal and political fallout, before you begin the strategic response that I'm sure you're already planning, I need to know something. Are you actually transitioning to legitimate business? Or is that just cover story for the same operations under different names?" The question was direct enough to be insulting, and brave enough to be admirable, asked by someone who'd risked everything to save him, but wanted to know if that risk had been invested in someone worth saving. Ronan met her eyes in the window's reflection, and made the choice between comfortable lies and uncomfortable honesty. "I'm trying to transition," he said carefully, which isn't the same as having completely transitioned, because power structures built over decades don't dismantle overnight without creating vacuums that get filled by people worse than what they replaced. Scarlett's question hung in the air between them like smoke from an extinguished candle, the residue of burned illusions that couldn't be ignored or dismissed with easy reassurances. Ronan appreciated that she'd asked directly, rather than accepting the sanitized version of his life that most people preferred to believe. The comfortable fiction that men like him could simply decide to be different and have reality accommodate that decision. The truth was messier than redemption narratives allowed, involved compromises that idealists would condemn, and pragmatists would understand as necessary evils in service of eventual good. "My father built an empire on fear and violence, controlled territories through brutality that made cooperation preferable to resistance, and died in federal prison while I was still learning to drive," Ronan said, offering history as context rather than excuse. "I inherited that empire at 22, with the choice between maintaining his methods or finding different ones, and I chose evolution over revolution, because burning everything down would have created chaos that hurt innocent people caught in the transition." The strategic patience had taken 8 years of careful maneuvering, of slowly replacing violence with legitimate business leverage. The attorney's call went to voicemail while Ronan continued speaking, prioritizing honesty with Scarlett over damage control with legal counsel. Every restaurant, every construction company, every logistics operation I control now started as a front for illegal activity, but has been gradually transformed into actual profitable legitimate business, he explained, while pulling up financial records that documented the transition. The process requires maintaining relationships with people who haven't evolved as fast, which means I'm not completely clean, but I'm actively moving toward being clean. Scarlett studied the financial documents with surprising comprehension, her community college business classes apparently providing enough foundation to understand what she was looking at. You're essentially running two parallel operations, the legitimate businesses that are genuinely legal, and the transitional operations where you're phasing out illegal components, while maintaining enough connection to prevent rivals from filling the vacuum. She summarized with accuracy that impressed him. It's ethically complicated, but strategically sound if the goal is minimizing violence during the transformation. The observation revealed a mind capable of grasping nuance, rather than demanding absolute categories, an ability to hold complexity without collapsing into either complete condemnation or naive acceptance. Exactly right. And that ethical complication is why the Morettis see me as traitor rather than competitor, Ronan confirmed while appreciating her analytical capabilities. They believe the old ways are the only ways, that legitimacy is weakness, that my transition represents betrayal of some code they invented to justify their own violence. The generational conflict was philosophical as much as territorial. Marcus's decision to cooperate with federal investigators would accelerate Ronan's transition by necessity rather than choice, forcing him to sever connections faster than planned and accept the instability that rapid change would create. His testimony will expose operations I'm still in the process of dismantling, which means I'll need to make hard choices about cutting ties immediately, rather than managing gradual transitions, Ronan said, while calculating the political and financial costs. Some people who've been loyal to me will get hurt by that acceleration, which I regret but can't prevent. The moral weight of those consequences was visible in his expression, the burden of leadership that required accepting collateral damage to people who'd trusted him even when protecting them became impossible. Scarlett saw that weight and seemed to respect it, recognizing the difference between someone who caused harm carelessly and someone who caused it reluctantly while trying to minimize the impact. You can't save everyone, she said quietly, offering the absolution he probably didn't deserve but definitely needed. Sometimes the best you can do is save as many as possible and carry the guilt about the ones you couldn't. Her understanding suggested personal experience with impossible choices, with situations where all options involved someone getting hurt, and the only question was who would bear the cost. Ronan wanted to ask what had taught her that particular lesson, but respected that some histories revealed themselves gradually, rather than through direct inquiry. Instead, he returned to the immediate situation that required strategic response despite the late hour and accumulated exhaustion. The FBI will want to interview you as witness to the conspiracy, he said, shifting to practical concerns. They'll want to know how you knew about the poison, what made you suspicious enough to warn me, whether you had prior knowledge of the plot or stumbled into it accidentally, Ronan continued, while mentally preparing her for interrogation that would be thorough and potentially aggressive. Your story needs to be completely truthful because lies get detected and turn witnesses into suspects, but you should also understand that federal investigators will try to pressure you into providing information about me that goes beyond tonight's specific incident. The FBI would see her as potential leverage against him. Scarlett absorbed that warning with the composure of someone who'd already accepted that her life had fundamentally changed and was now focused on navigating the new reality rather than mourning the old one. So I tell them exactly what I saw and heard, cooperate fully with the investigation into the attempted murder, but decline to speculate about your business operations or personal character beyond what's directly relevant to tonight, she said, establishing boundaries that protected both truth and discretion. I can do that without compromising either my integrity or your privacy. The strength in her voice reminded Ronan why he'd been drawn to protect her beyond simple gratitude for the warning. She possessed the rare combination of moral courage and tactical intelligence that made her genuinely dangerous to enemies and valuable to allies. You'll need a lawyer present during FBI interviews, someone who understands federal procedure and can ensure they don't manipulate your testimony through leading questions or selective editing, he advised, while already considering which attorney from his stable of legal counsel would be appropriate for representing her interests without creating appearance of coordination. Vincent appeared from the kitchen with food that neither of them had requested but both needed, the kind of sustenance that acknowledged their bodies required fuel, regardless of whether appetite existed. "The other partners are secure and debriefed," Vincent reported, while setting down plates of sandwiches and fruit that looked almost offensively normal given the circumstances. "They want to know if tonight changes our business arrangement or if we proceed as planned, once the immediate threat is neutralized." The question was reasonable, given that association with Ronan had nearly gotten them killed. Ronan considered the politics of that inquiry while watching Scarlett pick at food with mechanical motions that suggested eating from duty rather than hunger. "Tell them we proceed as planned, but with enhanced security protocols and complete transparency about threats that might affect their operations," he decided, choosing to maintain partnerships built on mutual benefit rather than dissolving them out of risk aversion. "If they want to withdraw, that's their prerogative, but I won't make that decision for them by assuming tonight's attempt reflects ongoing danger rather than one-time conspiracy that's now exposed." The decision to continue rather than retreat was calculated risk based on assessment that the Moretti conspiracy had invested everything in tonight's attempt and lacked resources for immediate follow-up now that their plan was exposed and their inside man was in federal custody. "They shot their shot and missed," Ronan explained his reasoning to Scarlett, whose opinion he found himself valuing despite her lack of experience in these matters. Trying again quickly would be desperate rather than strategic, and desperate attacks are easier to defend against because desperation makes people sloppy. Scarlett finished her sandwich and stood with the restless energy of someone whose mind wouldn't quiet, despite physical exhaustion demanding rest. "I keep thinking about the birthday party at the restaurant," she said, while pacing the perimeter of the room. "Those people singing off-key while someone's family celebrated 40 years of life, completely oblivious that professional killers were positioning themselves to commit mass murder in the same space." The contrast between innocent joy and orchestrated death haunted her in ways that statistics about prevented casualties couldn't address. "That's the weight you'll carry from tonight. Not just the lives you saved, but the knowledge of how close ordinary people came to being killed as collateral damage to conspiracies they'll never know existed," Ronan said, recognizing the specific burden that came with awareness of violence operating beneath civilization's surface. Most people live their entire lives without understanding how thin the membrane is between their safe, normal world and the chaos that people like me work to contain. His role had always been managing that boundary, ensuring the violence stayed in channels that didn't overflow into civilian spaces. Scarlett stopped pacing and turned to face him with expression that mixed exhaustion and determination in equal measure. "I don't want to spend the rest of my life jumping at shadows and wondering if every stranger is an assassin," she declared with the firmness of someone establishing boundaries against fear. "So, here's what's going to happen. I'll cooperate with the FBI investigation. I'll accept reasonable security precautions, and I'll take whatever help you're offering to rebuild my disrupted life, but I refuse to become paralyzed by what-ifs and paranoid scenarios." The declaration was as much for herself as for him. Ronan recognized the psychological self-defense in that statement, the decision to process trauma through action, rather than retreat, to reclaim agency by establishing how she would respond, rather than allowing circumstances to dictate her reactions. "That's the right approach," he confirmed, while respecting her need to assert control over narrative and trajectory. "Fear is a tool that serves you when it enhances awareness, but destroys you when it prevents living. And you're too capable and too courageous to let tonight's events define you as victim, rather than as someone who acted decisively when action mattered most." The dawn arrived with the subtle shift from artificial light to natural illumination that transformed the penthouse's atmosphere from bunker to sanctuary, Philadelphia's skyline emerging from darkness with the promise of new beginning, despite the previous night's violence. Ronan had spent the intervening hours managing cascading consequences, coordinating with attorneys, briefing security teams, reviewing intelligence reports, and monitoring Marcus's FBI debriefing through contacts who traded information for future considerations. Sleep had been impossible anyway, with mind racing through scenarios and contingencies, calculating moves and counter-moves in the chess game that survival had become. Scarlett emerged from the bedroom looking only slightly more rested than when she'd retreated hours earlier. Her borrowed clothes rumpled, and her expression carrying the weight of someone who'd spent the night processing trauma, rather than escaping it through unconsciousness. "I dreamed about the restaurant," she said without preamble, accepting coffee from Vincent with the automatic courtesy of someone trained in service industry hospitality. "Except in the dream, I didn't warn you. Just delivered the note to the kitchen like I was supposed to and watched everything unfold the way the conspirators planned. The guilt of an alternative timeline that existed only in imagination. The nightmare revealed her subconscious processing the magnitude of choice and consequence, exploring the horror of the path not taken to reinforce the correctness of her actual decision. Those dreams will fade over time as your mind integrates the experience and accepts that you made the right choice, Ronan offered with the certainty of someone who'd spent years managing his own nightmares about decisions made and roads taken. The fact that you feel guilty about a scenario that didn't happen proves you understand the weight of what you prevented, which is healthy even when it's uncomfortable. The morning news was already covering the previous night's incident with the breathless urgency that media brought to stories involving fire alarms, restaurant evacuations, and the kind of dramatic police presence that suggested more was happening than official statements acknowledged. Upscale Philadelphia restaurant evacuated after suspicious activity and fire alarm trigger, the headline read, accompanied by footage of Sofito Doro surrounded by emergency vehicles. No mention yet of poison or assassination attempts, but that would change once Marcus's testimony became public, and federal prosecutors decided how much to reveal. Ronan's attorney called with updates on the legal landscape that was rapidly evolving as the FBI investigation expanded beyond Marcus's initial testimony to encompass the entire Moretti conspiracy. They're offering you immunity in exchange for testimony about the organization's historic operations, and your knowledge of criminal activity conducted by the previous leadership, the attorney summarized with clinical efficiency. It's a good deal if you're serious about transitioning to complete legitimacy, because it gives you federal protection while you sever remaining connections to questionable associates and operations. The offer represented opportunity and risk in equal measure. Immunity meant freedom from prosecution for past activities, but also meant cooperating with investigations that would expose allies who hadn't yet made similar transitions. I need time to consider how accepting that deal impacts people who trusted me, Ronan replied, while calculating the ethical mathematics of betrayal justified by larger strategic goals. Some of them are genuinely trying to go legitimate like I am, and I won't burn them to save myself unless there's no other option. Loyalty had limits, but those limits shouldn't be crossed casually. Scarlett listened to the one-sided conversation with growing understanding of the complexities that defined Ronan's world, the moral calculations that people who lived in absolute categories would judge as ethical failure, but that people who operated in reality recognized as necessary navigation through impossible situations. You're trying to figure out who deserves protection and who deserves exposure, she observed once the call ended, drawing lines between people who are genuinely transitioning away from criminal activity and people who are just using legitimacy as better cover for continuing the same operations. The accuracy of her summary revealed attention and intelligence. Exactly. And those determinations aren't always clear, because people exist on spectrums, rather than in discrete categories, Ronan confirmed, while reviewing files on associates whose fates might depend on his testimony decisions. Someone who was violent and ruthless a decade ago might now be running legitimate business and supporting their grandchildren's education, while someone who presents as respectable businessmen might be actively engaged in operations that harm vulnerable people. The judgment required understanding context and trajectory, rather than just examining snapshots of current status or historic actions. The morning progressed with a parade of briefings and updates that painted an increasingly clear picture of the conspiracy's scope and the Moretti family's desperation to reclaim relevance through Ronan's elimination. They've been hemorrhaging territory and income since you consolidated operations under legitimate structures, the security director explained during a video conference. Their remaining operations are mostly protection rackets and loan sharking, old-school crimes that don't scale and don't generate the kind of money needed to maintain their lifestyle expectations. The attempted assassination had been as much about wounded pride as territorial ambition. Scarlett watched these briefings with the focused attention of someone trying to understand the full context of the situation she'd inserted herself into through intervention. Her questions were precise and revealed growing comprehension of the political dynamics that governed Ronan's world. So the Morettis saw your transition to legitimacy as theft of their territory rather than evolution of the business model, she summarized after one particularly detailed briefing. They couldn't compete with your legitimate operations because their skill set is intimidation and violence, which don't work against businesses that can call actual police for protection. The analysis was sophisticated enough to impress the security director, who'd initially been skeptical about Ronan involving a civilian waitress in strategic discussions. That's exactly right, And it's why they're finished, regardless of whether last night's attempt had succeeded, the director confirmed, while pulling up financial projections. Even if they'd killed Ronan, his operations would have continued under existing management structure because he built systems rather than personality cult, while their operations die with them because everything depends on personal fear and intimidation that can't be institutionalized or transferred. Ronan found himself watching Scarlett as she processed these briefings, observing how quickly she adapted to information and situations that should have been completely foreign to her background and experience. Her intelligence was obvious, but it was her emotional stability that truly impressed. Most people confronted with the reality of organized crime and assassination conspiracies would either romanticize it or recoil in horror, but she maintained analytical distance that allowed engagement without being overwhelmed. The combination of courage, intelligence, and stability was rare enough to be remarkable. "I need to make a decision about the FBI immunity offer," Ronan said once the briefings concluded, and they were alone again, except for Vincent maintaining discreet presence in the kitchen. "Accepting it means full cooperation with investigations that will expose operations I'd rather keep private, but it also accelerates my transition to complete legitimacy by forcing immediate severance of questionable connections." The strategic benefit was clear even if the ethical cost was uncomfortable, which made this one of those decisions where pragmatism and principle pointed in the same direction despite feeling like compromise. Scarlett moved to the window that had become her thinking space, watching Philadelphia wake up and begin another day of ordinary activity that would never know how close it had come to being disrupted by violence in one of its upscale restaurants. "You're asking my opinion on whether you should take the immunity deal," she said without turning around, reading the implicit question in his statement, "which is strange because I'm not qualified to advise you on federal legal strategy or the ethics of cooperating with investigations that might hurt people who trusted you. You're qualified because you've already proven you can make difficult moral decisions under pressure when the consequences are serious and immediate," Ronan replied, while joining her at the window, their reflections side by side in the glass. "Last night you chose to risk your own safety to prevent harm to strangers, which demonstrates the kind of ethical clarity I need input from when making decisions that affect multiple lives." He wasn't flattering her, but stating observed fact about character, demonstrated through action rather than claimed through words. Scarlett turned to face him directly rather than continuing the conversation through reflections, her expression serious with the weight of responsibility he'd placed on her with that request for counsel. "Take the immunity deal," she said after a moment of consideration. "Not because it's strategically advantageous or legally protective, but because you can't build legitimate business on foundation of loyalty to people who haven't earned that loyalty through their own commitment to legitimate operations." The advice was clear-eyed and pragmatic, free from sentimentality about honor among thieves or romantic notions of underworld codes. "The people who genuinely matter, the ones who are actually trying to evolve like you are, will understand why you cooperated and will probably be relieved that federal protection gives them cover for making similar transitions," she continued with reasoning that revealed understanding of group dynamics and strategic thinking. "And the people who get exposed and prosecuted because of your testimony are the ones who would have eventually become problems anyway, either by drawing law enforcement attention that splashes onto your legitimate operations or by actively sabotaging your transition because it threatens their continued criminal activity." The analysis was so precisely aligned with Ronan's own thinking that he found himself smiling despite the grimness of the situation, recognition that she'd articulated the justification he'd been circling without quite reaching. "You're right, and I think I needed to hear someone else say it to overcome my resistance to what felt like betrayal," he acknowledged, while pulling out his phone to call the attorney back. "The immunity deal serves everyone except the people who deserve to be exposed, which makes it the right choice even if it feels uncomfortable." The attorney answered on the first ring, clearly having anticipated that Ronan's decision would come swiftly once the moral framework became clear enough to override lingering doubts about loyalty and honor among criminals who'd never actually earned such considerations. "I'm accepting the immunity offer," Ronan stated without preamble, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who'd made peace with a difficult choice through understanding, rather than resignation. "Draft the cooperation agreement with whatever terms the prosecutors require, schedule my testimony for whenever they need it, and prepare briefings on which associates will be affected so I can manage the personal notifications before they learn about my cooperation through federal indictments." The decision to inform people directly, rather than letting them be blindsided by prosecutors, demonstrated respect even while acknowledging that respect wouldn't prevent their prosecution. Scarlett watched him navigate the call with the professional efficiency of someone coordinating complex operations, her expression revealing approval, mixed with something deeper, that might have been pride in witnessing someone choose difficult right over comfortable wrong. She'd inserted herself into his life through intervention that saved him from assassination, but in the months since that night, she'd become something more significant than savior or witness. She'd become the moral compass he consulted when his own sense of direction became confused by competing obligations and unclear ethics. The foundation they were building together, both the literal scholarship organization and the metaphorical partnership between two people learning to trust after lifetimes of justified caution, represented possibility that neither had imagined before conspiracy and courage collided in an upscale Italian restaurant. 6 months transformed landscapes both literal and metaphorical, with the inexorable patience of seasons changing, despite human drama attempting to accelerate or prevent natural progression. The Moretti conspiracy had collapsed under federal investigation that exposed not just the attempted assassination, but decades of criminal activity that sent the family's remaining leadership to prison for sentences that would extend beyond their natural lifespans. Marcus's testimony had been devastating but redundant. The FBI had built cases from financial records and surveillance that would have succeeded without his cooperation, though his insider knowledge had accelerated prosecutions and prevented years of expensive legal maneuvering. Ronan's immunity deal had worked exactly as his attorney predicted, providing protection while requiring disclosure that exposed operations he'd already been phasing out, but accelerated the timeline from gradual to immediate. The transition had been painful for associates who'd depended on those operations. But Scarlett's prediction had also proven accurate. The ones genuinely committed to legitimate business had adapted and even thrived under the cover of federal cooperation, while the ones exposed and prosecuted had indeed been the people who would have eventually become liabilities. The ethical mathematics had balanced toward justice even if the individual cases remained complicated. Soffito d'Oro had never reopened, the restaurant's elegant spaces remaining dark and empty, while ownership disputes played out in court between the legitimate proprietor who'd been forced to sell to Moretti front companies and federal prosecutors seeking asset forfeiture. The tables where conspirators had positioned themselves to commit murder sat gathering dust. The kitchen where Dmitry Volkov had prepared poisoned ossobuco, now cleaned of evidence but permanently tainted by association. Philadelphia had other upscale Italian restaurants that absorbed the displaced clientele without missing the location that had become synonymous with attempted assassination. Scarlett had returned to community college, but with circumstances dramatically altered from her previous life of double shifts and financial anxiety about tuition payments. Ronan had established a foundation, completely legitimate and transparently operated, that provided scholarships to students demonstrating exceptional moral courage in crisis situations. She'd been the first recipient, and the Foundation's board had insisted she also serve as Director of Program Development, a paid position that recognized her intelligence and character while providing sustainable income that didn't require serving tables or relying on Ronan's direct patronage. The transition from Waitress to Foundation Director had been awkward initially, with Scarlett struggling against feeling like charity case or kept woman, despite the legitimate nature of the opportunity. I earned this position through demonstrated judgment and capability. She'd had to remind herself repeatedly during the first months, fighting imposter syndrome that whispered she'd simply been lucky to overhear the right conversation. Eventually, the work itself proved she belonged. Her program development brought in partnerships with other organizations focused on rewarding civilian heroism, and applications for the Courage scholarships grew to exceed available funding within the first quarter. Ronan's legitimate business empire had consolidated and expanded as predicted, his construction companies winning contracts through competitive bidding rather than intimidation, his logistics operations running efficiently on normal profit margins rather than inflated fees backed by implied threats. The transition had reduced his gross revenue but increased his net worth through elimination of costs associated with maintaining criminal infrastructure, legal fees, security against rivals, payoffs to corrupt officials, and the premium charged by suppliers willing to deal with questionable clients. Legitimacy proved more profitable than crime once the full accounting was completed. The business transformation had created unexpected ripple effects throughout Philadelphia's economic landscape, with other operators observing Ronan's successful transition and calculating whether similar evolution might serve their own interests better than continued operation in gray areas that invited federal attention and limited growth potential. 3 former competitors had approached him quietly, seeking advice on legitimizing their operations, Conversations that 6 months ago would have been unthinkable, given the territorial hostility that had previously defined their relationships. Ronan found himself becoming inadvertent consultant on how to transition from criminal enterprise to legitimate business, a role that carried irony he appreciated even while recognizing the social value of helping others make similar journeys away from violence and toward sustainable legal operations that contributed to communities rather than exploiting them. The media coverage of the Moretti conspiracy's collapse had been extensive, but carefully managed through cooperation between federal prosecutors and Ronan's legal team, with the narrative emphasizing the conspiracy's exposure through alert civilian intervention rather than focusing on Ronan's historic criminal associations or the immunity deal that had facilitated his testimony. Scarlett had been profiled in local news as the courageous waitress whose observation prevented tragedy, though she'd declined most interview requests out of desire to move forward, rather than being defined by single dramatic incident, regardless of how heroic that incident had been. The selective publicity served dual purposes of establishing her credibility for foundation work while protecting her privacy about the ongoing relationship with Ronan that conservative observers might have interpreted cynically as transactional, rather than genuinely romantic, despite all evidence suggesting authentic connection built on mutual respect and complementary strengths. Their relationship had evolved with the careful patience of two people who'd met during crisis and needed time to discover whether connection forged under extraordinary circumstances could sustain through ordinary life. The romance that developed was neither sudden passion nor awkward obligation, but rather gradual recognition that they balanced each other's strengths and compensated for each other's weaknesses. Ronan's strategic thinking combined with Scarlett's moral clarity created partnership that was intellectually satisfying and emotionally grounding for both of them. The Foundation's offices occupied renovated warehouse space in a neighborhood that was itself transitioning from industrial decay to vibrant mixed-use development, a physical metaphor for the transformations both Ronan and Scarlett had undergone. The open floor plan and transparent operations were deliberate choices that signaled departure from the secretive maneuvering that had characterized Ronan's previous career. Board meetings were recorded and published, financial statements were audited by independent firms, and decisions about scholarship recipients were made by committees rather than individual fiat. Scarlett sat in her office reviewing applications for the Courage Scholarships with the careful attention of someone who understood that these decisions affected real lives and deserved more than cursory evaluation. A high school senior who'd intervened to stop assault despite being smaller than the attacker, a college student who'd reported academic fraud despite pressure to maintain silence, a graduate student who'd exposed safety violations at a laboratory researching treatments for childhood diseases. Each application represented someone who'd chosen principle over convenience and deserved support for the fine choice. Ronan appeared in her doorway with the coffee that had become their afternoon ritual, a moment of connection and decompression between morning's intensity and evening's obligations. The FBI closed the final case related to the Moretti conspiracy today, he reported while setting down her cup exactly the way she preferred it. Too much cream, not quite enough sugar. All primary conspirators are serving sentences. All secondary participants who cooperated received reduced charges, and the prosecutor who handled the case thanked me for my cooperation, while subtly implying that continued good behavior is expected. The dance of federal cooperation required ongoing demonstration that his transition to legitimacy was genuine, rather than strategic repositioning for future criminal activity, a skepticism Ronan accepted as reasonable given his history, even if it was occasionally irritating in its persistence. "They'll be watching me for years to ensure I don't revert to old patterns," he said with resignation that lacked bitterness. "Which is fine, because the watching actually helps me maintain discipline about staying completely legitimate, turns external surveillance into accountability mechanism that prevents backsliding during moments of temptation." Scarlett appreciated that philosophical framing of what could have been experienced as oppression, the ability to recontextualize constraint as support rather than punishment. "You've become the person you were trying to become," she observed while gesturing to the scholarship applications spread across her desk. "These kids who did the right thing at personal cost, who chose courage when self-interest would have been easier. That's who you are now, not who you used to be back when power was measured by fear inspired rather than lives improved." The validation mattered more than Ronan would have admitted even 6 months ago, before Scarlett had taught him that accepting recognition for growth wasn't vanity, but rather acknowledgement that transformation required effort worth celebrating. "I couldn't have made this transition without you," he said simply, the truth too obvious to dress up with elaborate phrasing. Your intervention saved my life, but your continued presence has saved my character by providing living example of what integrity looks like when it's tested under fire." Scarlett stood and moved around the desk to stand close enough that the space between them felt intentional rather than accidental, the distance of two people who'd earned the right to proximity through shared experience and proven trust. "We saved each other," she corrected with the gentle firmness of someone who wouldn't accept self-deprecation even when disguised as gratitude. "I gave you warning about immediate physical danger. You gave me opportunity to become something more than I'd imagined possible, and together we've built something that helps other people who demonstrate the kind of courage that deserves recognition and support." The kiss was neither their first nor tentative, but rather the comfortable intimacy of two people who'd discovered that partnership extended beyond crisis management into sustainable relationship. The Foundation's open floor plan meant their moment was visible to staff, who studiously pretended not to notice, respecting the privacy of two people who'd earned the right to stolen moments during workday intensity. Philadelphia's afternoon sun streamed through the warehouse windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like celebration of ordinary beauty in transformed space. Vincent appeared with the impeccable timing of someone who'd been monitoring the situation and judged that interrupting was now acceptable, carrying documents that required Ronan's signature on contracts that would expand the Foundation's reach into 3 new cities. "The partnership agreements with the civic organizations are finalized," he reported, while maintaining the professional distance that allowed him to witness their relationship without making it awkward through commentary or judgment. "We'll be able to fund twice as many scholarships next year and establish permanent presence in communities that need recognition for everyday heroism." The growth represented mission expansion that both excited and intimidated Scarlett, the scale of impact growing beyond what she'd imagined during those early days, when simply surviving the conspiracy's aftermath had seemed like ambitious enough goal. "We're going to need more staff and probably larger offices," she said, while reviewing the partnership documents with the practical concern of someone who understood that expansion required infrastructure. "The warehouse is perfect for Philadelphia operations, but coordinating multi-city programs from single location creates bottlenecks." Ronan signed the documents while already mentally calculating the logistics of expansion. The strategic thinking that had served him in previous career now deployed toward legitimate goals that created value rather than extracted it through intimidation. "I own properties in all 3 target cities that would work as satellite offices," he offered, while recognizing that his real estate portfolio, acquired through various means over the years, could now serve purposes that justified rather than haunted their acquisition. "They're currently vacant or leased to tenants whose agreements are expiring soon." The evening approached with the golden light that photographers called magic hour, Philadelphia's skyline visible through the warehouse windows, transformed into silhouette against sunset that painted the sky in colors that seemed too vibrant for reality. Scarlett stood at the window as she had 6 months ago in the penthouse, but this time without the weight of processed trauma or uncertain future pressing down on her shoulders. The city below continued its oblivious activity, millions of lives intersecting and diverging without knowledge of the violence prevented or the transformation earned through courage demonstrated in crisis. "Thank you all for following this story," Scarlett said softly, as if addressing an invisible audience that had witnessed the journey from terrified waitress to Foundation director, from survival to thriving. "If you've been moved by what happened here, share it with others who need reminding that courage matters and that doing the right thing, even when it's dangerous and difficult, creates ripples that extend far beyond the immediate moment." Write in the comments where you're watching from, what courage means in your own life, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video, because your support helps us continue recognizing and rewarding the everyday heroes who make our community safer and our world better.